So my research project was on the Super Bowl and the effect on the economy. So some context. Lots of the money goes to the NFL from the Super Bowl, and a late study in 2023 showed that from Super Bowl LVII, that over $500 million was raised for the Super Bowl that went to the NFL. However, what most people don't know is that the NFL actually does not pay for the stadium renovations or the stadium construction costs of the stadium that is built or renovated for the Super Bowl. Instead, the NFL holds an auction where many cities bid on how much they'll pay for the stadium costs and renovations, and then the NFL picks who will pay the most and then allows them to be the host city. And because of this, the cities usually fund these stadium construction costs and renovation costs through extra taxes on the citizens. So most people automatically assume, well, I might be getting taxed, but these stadium constructions and renovations are good for the city and it'll help out economically. However, this is not the case most of the time. Two examples are the Miami Marlins Stadium and the Bulldog Stadium. In context with Miami Marlins Stadium, when they renovated that stadium, they did not have as much money as they needed to complete the costs, and because of that, they are still paying 20 years from now to this day to still complete the costs. And in addition, the Bulldog Stadium, even though they paid for the construction costs, it neither harmed or helped the city, despite people saying that it would. So from this, my problem statement is, what effect does the Super Bowl have on the unemployment rate and housing price of the host city? And the objectives here are to see if the Super Bowl has an impact on major cities through those aspects, through unemployment rate and the housing prices, and if so, is it positive or negative to the host city that is there? Sorry. And the significance is that we should see if the city should save money and take more time building stadiums instead of just rushing the cost and in order to become the host city. And we can also see if major cities should invest in the sports stadiums and the Super Bowl in order to, and if they are necessary for economic growth. So definition of terms, the only two terms that you really need to know are the unemployment rate, and that's the percentage of unemployed people to the labor force, and the labor force, which is the amount of people that are employed and unemployed in the city. So my lit review, first was Taylor Skaggs from Boston College. He did a meta-analysis, and he saw that construction took a heavy toll and affected the city negatively, which was against what most people thought. And then my next source was Carol Amadon, and she did historical research, and she looked at the Georgia Bulldog Stadium, and she looked historically over time on if the renovations that they put in place actually helped or hurt the Atlantic City area, and she saw no correlation between the Georgia Dome and the growth of Atlanta. And lastly, I had Geoffrey Profiter, who went to GWU. He did a factor analysis method, and he reviewed arenas from NBA stadiums, and he saw that it did improve MSA per capita income. And I kind of got three different responses here, so I wanted to see if it applied like to the Super Bowl, if it was positive, negative, or no correlation at all to the effect of the stadium. And my method is correlational research. So what I'll be doing is I'll be having graphs that have unemployment rate on one side, and then on the other, it'll have cities down here, and then years on the top. And then I'll correlate if over time, if the correlation was positive, then that means the city did have good growth. And if the correlation was negative, it meant the city did not have good growth. And if there was no correlation, then the city was mostly stayed the same. And then I'll use the Pearson's correlation on my graph. And one thing I have to note is that correlation is not causation. So my first graph is house prices between different cities before the Super Bowl. So right here we have house prices, and it goes from $0 up to $80,000. And on the bottom, we have all the cities, and then we also have the years on top. And we can see that over time, throughout the years, that the house prices increased. So my next graph, this was Phoenix unemployment rate over time. And the reason I chose this graph was it was different from the other unemployment rates, because even throughout the Super Bowl and the Super Bowl construction, the unemployment rate mostly stayed the same, which was unlike any other graph. And in that same matter, this was Inglewood or Los Angeles. And the crazy thing was that in this graph, the unemployment rate actually, or the employment rate actually went down when the construction cost was happening. And this was in 2020. And then lastly, my last graph was correlation between different cities' unemployment during stadium renovations for the Super Bowl. So I have my correlation coefficient here. So -1 meant there was a negative correlation, and 0.5 meant there was a slightly positive correlation. And since they all differed, it kind of showed no correlation between any of the different cities and the stadium renovations. So in my discussion, as we saw from the first graph, all the house prices went up, and it showed a positive correlation between house prices and cities. So when a city hosts a Super Bowl, the house prices do go up, which makes sense since most people are buying like Airbnbs or renting houses out. And we saw some jumps. So for example, Inglewood, the house prices jumped a lot more than Minnesota, and that might have to do with the host city. Like some people might not want to move to Minnesota instead of California because California is more of a popular area. So also for the unemployment rate, it was very like scattered, and there was no correlation as shown in the final graph. And this was probably due to the time period, like what I showed with the Inglewood graph. So during COVID, that not a lot of people were allowed to work. So that's probably why the house prices went down, which kind of caused the scattered graph. And so implications, so we can tell from this research that the Super Bowl is useful for a host city if they're looking to increase house prices for that area economically, but it's not super helpful for unemployment as most cities won't know what's happening because some cities went down and some cities went up in the unemployment rate, and some cities stayed the same, like Phoenix. So some limitations I had was the time period. So I only did 2015 to 2023. But I didn't go all the way back to 1960. So if I went back to 1960, it might have shown more. In addition, the research time, I didn't have as much time to research as much as I could have. And lastly, there's other incomes as money, such as selling jerseys and t-shirts in shops, other than unemployment and house prices. So lastly, my design for future research, I would see about other stadiums or arenas such as the NBA and the MLB and see if their playoffs in the host city also is the same rate as the NFL, in which it has house prices going up and unemployment rate not so sure. And then also see other income streams such as jersey prices selling and restaurant sellings as well as people go to watch the game. And lastly, I would try to see which cities would be the best to host from the unemployment rate and house prices. So as we saw from the graphs, popular places such as Inglewood, California went more than Minnesota. So if we could see which places would be best to host, such as California, because it's more popular and it's not as cold, then that was something that we could do as well. Thank you. I realize I forgot a bibliography slide.
Okay, yeah, make sure you add that next time. Okay, good. Well, you're at about 8:30, which is great. I mean, you have lots of time to work with, and I am going to recommend a few things that you should probably add. Your introduction's okay, but you're going into your research question way too soon. You haven't even presented your lit review. And remember, that's supposed to contextualize the question you're asking and why you're asking it. So don't jump right into, this is the data that I'm going to look at. Like, let your lit review explain that. And then your lit review, you just went through it too briefly. You were 4 minutes to the point where you were presenting your results, and you're supposed to be about 50-50. So you need to go 2 to 3 more minutes talking about the background, your lit review, and your method. So for your research, I would suggest a full slide for each one of those studies. And what you really want to do is present the authors, the purpose, the method, the conclusion, and their application to your research. So make sure each one of the studies identifies those. I think you spent about 40 seconds on all 3 of your research studies, and you should spend probably close to a minute on each one. After all, these are the reasons why you did this research. You selected them, which means they must be really, really relevant. And then you made a big deal that you were going to do correlations, right? But then all these graphs you showed, none of them was a correlative graph. Like, you even showed an example of a correlative graph. It's like you're going to graph time here, and here you're going to graph something else, and you're going to see the correlation. Your correlations were actually graphed next to each other as correlation constants with no horizontal axis. Like I didn't even know what those different correlations represented. If you're gonna make a big deal out of correlations, you have to feature correlations in your results. And I told you this before, but some of your graphs are really poor. They don't have titles on them. Like, I'm not sure what the point is of having different colors for different years and different months along the bottom. That doesn't tell the story you want. All you want is to capture the time period post Super Bowl in order to see the impact it has. So I don't know why you're showing a 15-year period when the Super Bowl only happened in that city at one time. How about the year after it happened? That's what you want to feature. So make sure your graphs correctly contextualize the time period you're interested in. That way it'll show your results much more succinctly than the graphs that you have right now. And if that means regraphing them, then regraph them. I like the color schemes on your graphs, but I don't like that the information it shows is totally non-contextualized. The final thing is, in your results, you really only chose to talk about two narratives. Your two main narratives, which is how does this impact home prices and how does it impact on unemployment. And I think what you need to do is find those additional narratives. It's one of the reasons why you're 8 minutes, is that your research presents a simple story and it needs to be more nuanced and complex. With all that data, you didn't find relationships between different cities and maybe want to explore that, like why these two cities saw an uptick in unemployment and why these two saw a downtick, why these cities saw greater home price changes and these didn't. Because that's what you promised at the very beginning. You said, you know, there's kind of a changeable impact of how the Super Bowl helps the city. And by the end, it was just one flavor. It was all like there's just one impact and it helps home prices and it doesn't do anything to unemployment. You just destroyed all the nuance, which is different cities may have had different impacts. So you've got to return to that and say, what does each city's numbers look like? Why are they different? How are they similar? And again, you didn't talk at all about implications. Like, what does this mean about a city's bidding for the Super Bowl? Like, you need to talk about that as well. So, as I said, I think you have the core of this and you have all the data you need. You're just not using it to tell a very good story. And I'm sure your paper mirrors this presentation, which means you've got to fix both those. Yeah. And I think if you fix all those things, you're going to be fine. And as I said, you got tons of time. You've got 4 or 5 more minutes to work with in your presentation. You can add a ton and not worry about